Picture a prison built entirely by the hands of the men it would hold captive, not guards, not hired laborers. The inmates themselves quarrying the stone, lifting it into place, shaping the very walls that would keep them locked inside for years, sometimes for the rest of their lives. It happened at the hills of West Virginia, at a place that would come to be known as one of the most brutal penitentiaries in American history. And building the walls was only the beginning. Decades later, the state would ask one more thing of a condemned man inside these walls, something so twisted it got him transferred out for his own safety once it was done. Executions here would take dozens of lives, one going so wrong in front of a watching crowd that the state sealed every death behind closed doors for good. And when the reckoning finally came, when the courts finally looked at what this prison had become, it came from the same twisted place it always had. This is the story of a building raised by the damned, caged, and punished in ways that would one day be condemned by the law itself. This is the story of the West Virginia Penitentiary, more widely known as Moundsville Penitentiary. Chapter 1. A State Born Without a Prison. To understand how a prison could be built by the hands of the men it would imprison, you have to go back to the beginning. West Virginia was barely a state at all. It had broken away from Virginia in 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, carved out by mountain counties that refused to follow the rest of Virginia into secession. It was a new government built in a hurry, stitched together out of necessity rather than design, and like most things built in a hurry, it was missing pieces. One of those missing pieces was a prison. For the first years of its existence, West Virginia had nowhere to put the men its courts convicted. There was no state penitentiary or secure facility built to hold felons for years at a time. Instead, convicted men were scattered into county jails, never designed to hold them. Small buildings meant for a handful of drunks and debtors, suddenly forced to contain murderers and thieves. Governor Arthur Borman saw the problem clearly. As early as 1864, he ordered that felons from across the state be sent to the Ohio County Jail in Wheeling, the closest thing the young state had to a central holding facility. It was a temporary solution, and Borman knew it. He went to the legislature again and again, asking for money to build a real penitentiary. The legislature always said no. There were roads to build, schools to fund, a government still finding its legs. A prison could wait. But it could not wait forever. The Ohio County Jail began to buckle under the weight of prisoners it was never built to hold. The walls were not strong enough. The staff was not large enough. And in 1865, the consequence of that neglect became impossible to ignore. 9 inmates escaped. They simply walked free from a jail that could not keep them contained. The local newspapers seized on the story, and this time the public outrage did what years of quiet lobbying could not. The legislature finally listened. On February 7, 1866, West Virginia lawmakers approved the purchase of land for a new state penitentiary. They chose a site just outside the town of Moundsville, roughly 12 miles south of Wheeling. 10 acres were bought for $3,000, a patch of ground beside the Ohio River, close enough to the seat of government to be watched, far enough away to be forgotten. There is a story that has followed the town of Moundsville ever since, half legend, half civic joke, that the community was offered a choice between hosting the state penitentiary or the new state university, and chose the prison, believing it to be the more promising investment. Whether or not the story is entirely true, it captures something real about the moment. A prison was not seen as a burden to be avoided. It was seen as an opportunity, source of jobs, contracts, and permanence in a town still finding its place on the map. Chapter 2. With the hands of the condemned. The land had been chosen. The money had been approved. What West Virginia needed now was a design, something that would announce to anyone who saw it what exactly this building was for. The state turned to an architect named Levi Schofield, and Schofield did not design a simple holding facility. He designed a fortress. He modeled it after the Northern Illinois Penitentiary at Joliet, a building already infamous for its severity, and he rendered it in the Gothic Revival style. Turrets, battlements, lancet windows, a castellated silhouette that looked, from a distance, like something built to keep out an invading army rather than to hold a few hundred convicted men. One newspaper account from the era described the building's purpose plainly, saying its architecture was meant to convey a cheerless blank, indicative of the misery that awaited anyone who entered its walls. It was not an accident. It was the intention. Construction began in 1866, the same year the land was purchased, and it would not be finished for a full decade. The stone came from nearby quarries, sandstone cut from the Cameron and Rosby's Rock areas of Marshall County, and from sites along Big Grave Creek and the town of Hundred in Wetzel County. It was heavy, unforgiving material, and moving, shaping, and setting it into place required enormous manual labor. The state did not hire that labor from outside. It used the inmates themselves. This is the detail that sits at the center of everything Moundsville would become. The prisoners held in temporary quarters on the site, and later, the first men sentenced to serve time there were put to work raising their own prison. They quarried the stone, they hauled it, they cut it into shape and lifted it into walls that measured 5 feet thick at the base, tapering upward to roughly 2 feet at the top. They built the first structure on the site, the North Wagon Gate, completed in 1876 using hand-worked sandstone they had cut themselves. They built the South Hall, the first cell block finished, completed by 1868, a full 8 years before the rest of the complex would be ready. They built the outer wall, stretching along what is now Jefferson Avenue for roughly 826 feet, a barrier 24 feet high that would come to define the skyline of the entire town. Every stone that would later stand between an inmate and the outside world had already passed through the hands of a man just like him. The construction dragged on for reasons that will sound familiar to anyone who has watched a government project stall. Funding shortfalls, disputes over design, and the simple, brutal difficulty of raising a structure this massive using 19th century tools and methods. The legislature had to appropriate money more than once, first $50,000 in 1866, and then again in the years that followed, just to keep the work moving. By the time the penitentiary was truly complete, the total cost had climbed to $363,061, equivalent to something in the range of several $million today. The prison officially opened its doors in 1876, but opening was not the same as finishing. The north wing, meant eventually to house additional cells, was not yet ready to hold anyone. It stood as an open shell, serving instead as a kitchen, a dining hall, and a chapel. Meanwhile, the south wing, the one section that was truly finished, held 224 cells, each one measuring 4 feet by 7 feet, barely large enough for a man to lie down flat with his arms at his sides. Some of the very first inmates to walk through the gates in 1876 were men who had spent the previous years laboring on the walls now closing around them. They had built the gate they walked through. They had cut the stone now stacked above their heads. There is no gentler way to describe what that must have felt like, watching a door swing shut on a room you yourself had helped to build. A 4-story tower rose between the two wings, and it held the administrative offices, quarters for the warden and his family, and for a time, space set aside for female inmates. Over the following decades, the prison would keep growing and changing around the men living inside it. Steam heat arrived in the mid-1870s. Electric lighting replaced coal oil lamps by 1900. An elevator was installed in the administration building in 1894. Improvements kept coming, refining a building whose foundation had been laid, quite literally, by the hands of the condemned. The fortress was finished. But finishing a building is not the same as understanding what it will cost the people who live inside it, and that cost was only beginning to come due. Chapter 3: Inside the Cage. By the time construction had settled into something like its final form, the numbers on paper already told a grim story. The penitentiary had been designed to hold around 480 men. It was a number chosen with a certain confidence, the kind of number an architect and a legislature agree on when they are imagining an orderly institution filled with orderly rows of cells. Reality moved faster than the blueprints ever accounted for. Within the first decade, the population had already swollen past 700 men. It never really recovered from that early overreach. By the 1950s, more than 2,000 men called Moundsville Penitentiary home, and the arithmetic of the place had become almost unbearable. Cells built for one man now regularly held 2 or 3, with the third man sleeping on the floor, wedged between a steel bunk and a stone wall in a space that was never meant to hold a single mattress, let alone 3 bodies. The cells themselves were the true measure of what this prison was. 4 feet by 7 feet in the original south wing, later cells across the facility settled into a slightly larger, but still crushing 5 feet by 7 feet. A footprint smaller than many closets. Inside that space, a man was expected to sleep, sit, think, and grow old. There was a bunk, sometimes stacked 2 or 3 high, once overcrowding took hold. There was a toilet, often within arm's reach of the bed, with no partition and no pretense of privacy. There was a small window, if the cell was lucky enough to have one, cut into walls 2 feet thick at the top and 5 feet thick at the base, walls that swallowed sound and light in equal measure. Men showered in open communal spaces in full view of guards and other inmates. Privacy did not exist inside the penitentiary. It had been designed out of the architecture from the very first stone. The prison was organized into 2 main halls, north and south, each one a long corridor of cells stacked in tiers, with catwalks and iron staircases connecting the levels. The design was old even by the standards of its own era, borrowed from a 19th century penitentiary in Illinois, and it meant that almost everything happening inside the halls was visible to almost everyone else. There were no isolated pods, no separated wings that kept different populations from seeing, hearing, and reacting to one another. A fight breaking out on one tier could be watched by dozens of men on the tiers above and below. A scream traveled the length of the hall. This open, echoing design would later become one of the prison's greatest vulnerabilities. But in the daily grind of ordinary life, it simply meant that nothing was ever truly private, and nothing was ever truly quiet. For the men held in isolation, conditions sank even further. Inmates sent to segregation could spend up to 23 hours a day, locked alone in a cell barely large enough to pace in, an experience that broke some men and hardened others. Former guides who later worked at the site would recall that many isolated inmates spent their long hours fashioning makeshift weapons from whatever they could find. A survival instinct born from a prison, this crowded and this tense, where few men felt safe without one. Sanitation was a constant struggle. Aging plumbing strained under a population many times larger than anything the pipes had been built to serve. Insect infestations spread easily through cell blocks packed shoulder to shoulder with men and stone. And yet, day after day and year after year, the machine kept running. Meals were served in the same hall the men had helped construct as prisoners generations before them. Chapel services were held in a space carved out of the unfinished north wing. Work details moved through the yard, past the towering sandstone walls that had risen, stone by stone, from the labor of men just like them. There was a strange, closed-loop quality to life inside Moundsville Penitentiary. The walls did not need to say anything. This was not a place designed to rehabilitate a man. It was a place designed to contain him, indefinitely. Chapter 4. The Gallows Years. Overcrowding was one kind of suffering, slow and grinding. But Moundsville Penitentiary held another kind of suffering too, one that arrived quickly, publicly, and with an audience. Beginning in 1899, the state of West Virginia took over the responsibility of carrying out executions, centralizing what had once been handled county by county into a single place, a single gallows, inside the walls the inmates themselves had built. From that year forward, Moundsville Penitentiary was not only a prison, it was the place where the state killed the men it had condemned to die. For more than 3 decades, that killing was done in public. Hanging was the method, and for much of this era, the executions were treated less like private state business and more like civic spectacle. Crowds gathered, word spread through the surrounding towns whenever a hanging was scheduled, and people traveled to watch, some out of a grim sense of justice being served, others out of simple curiosity about death delivered on a schedule. It is a detail that feels almost impossible to reconcile with the modern world. The idea that an execution could function as a kind of public event, something people planned around, something they discussed afterward. But for the first chapter of Moundsville Penitentiary's Gallows era, that is exactly what it was. 85 men died this way, one by one, over more than 30 years, until a single afternoon in June of 1931 changed everything. The man scheduled to die that day was named Frank Heyer, convicted of killing his wife. The execution began the way so many others had before it. Heyer was led to the gallows. The rope was set. The trapdoor was released beneath his feet. But something went catastrophically wrong in the drop. Whether from the length of the rope, the force of the fall, or the simple, unpredictable brutality of the mechanism itself, the fall did not go the way an execution was supposed to go. What the gathered crowd witnessed that afternoon was horrifying enough that no official account of it ever fully agreed on the details, only that it would end public hangings in West Virginia for good. The reaction was immediate and permanent. Public hangings at Moundsville ended that day. State officials, shaken by what had happened in front of so many witnesses, moved swiftly to close the practice off from public view entirely. From that point forward, every execution carried out at the penitentiary would be conducted by invitation only, a closed and carefully controlled ceremony attended by a narrow list: the condemned man's family, the family of his victim, members of the press, clergy, and a coroner to confirm the death. The gallows did not disappear. Hangings continued for nearly 2 more decades. What had once been a public event became something hidden behind stone walls and iron doors, acknowledged by the state but no longer displayed to it. The change reflected something larger happening across the country during these same decades, a slow, uneven shift in how American society thought about capital punishment. Moving it out of the town square and behind closed institutional doors, treating it as a procedure to be managed rather than a spectacle to be witnessed. Moundsville Penitentiary's shift did not come from some quiet change in policy or philosophy. It came from a single, horrifying accident, one execution that went wrong in a way no one could unsee, and that moment marked the last time anyone outside a short list of invited witnesses would ever watch a person die inside those walls. The gallows had done its work for exactly half a century. But by the time the last man was hanged, the state was already looking toward a different method entirely, one it believed to be faster, cleaner, and more modern. It would need someone to build the device that made that method possible. And in a twist that seemed almost designed by the building itself, the state would turn, once again, to the very men locked inside its walls. Chapter 5: Old Sparky. By 1951, West Virginia had decided to move away from the gallows entirely. Hanging had ended 2 years earlier, and the state now wanted a method of execution that fit the image of a modern, mid-century justice system, cleaner and faster in theory, delivered by electricity rather than rope. What the state needed was a chair, a very specific piece of furniture, wired to end a human being on command, built to precise and unforgiving specifications. And once again, rather than looking outside its own walls for the labor to build it, the state of West Virginia looked inward to the population it already had locked inside Moundsville Penitentiary. The man chosen for the job was an inmate named Paul Glenn. He was serving time for murder, and he happened to have a skill the state needed. He was a trained electrician. Prison officials handed him the assignment, and Glenn set to work constructing the device that would come to be known with the same grim, folksy nickname used in electric chairs across the country: Old Sparky. He built the wooden frame, he ran the wiring, he tested the switches and the electrical connections piece by piece, making certain that when the moment came, the machine would function exactly as intended. It is difficult to imagine what must have gone through his mind while he worked. An electrician on death row, wiring together the exact device that could someday be used to execute him instead. He built it anyway, connection by connection, until the chair was complete and ready to be installed in the same execution chamber that had once held the gallows. The chair was bolted onto a low wooden platform, positioned directly over the spot where the old trapdoor used to open beneath condemned men during the hanging era. It was built on top of the very mechanism it was designed to replace, and once it was finished, once it had been tested and approved, the state did something that revealed just how uneasy this whole arrangement made everyone involved. Paul Glenn was transferred out of Moundsville Penitentiary and sent to another facility entirely. The official reasoning was rarely stated plainly, but the truth, as it circulated among the men who remained, was simple and brutal. The other inmates wanted him dead for what he had built. A man who constructs the device that will kill his fellow prisoners does not stay popular in a place like this. Whatever protection the state could offer him, it apparently could not offer it inside the same walls where his creation now sat waiting. Old Sparky went into service that same year, and over the following 8 years, it claimed 9 lives. The men who sat in that chair came from different backgrounds, counties, and circumstances, but all of them shared one thing: a conviction for murder, one of the specific categories of crime that could still bring the death penalty in West Virginia at the time. Among the earliest to die in the chair were 2 men named Harry Burdett and Fred Painter, sentenced to death after stomping a soft drink salesman to death during a street altercation in Charleston in 1949. Their executions, along with the 7 that followed over the coming years, marked a new and different kind of dying inside Moundsville's walls. No longer the sudden drop and snap of a rope, but the deliberate, sustained application of electrical current administered inside a chamber that had seen death delivered by 2 entirely different machines within the span of a single century. The chair claimed its final victim in 1959. West Virginia would go on to abolish capital punishment entirely in 1965. Old Sparky fell permanently silent. 94 men had died inside Moundsville Penitentiary by execution across 6 decades, 85 by hanging, and 9 by electrocution. A grim tally that placed this single prison among the deadliest execution sites in the country's history relative to its size. The chair still exists today. It was never destroyed, never quietly disposed of the way so much of the prison's darker equipment eventually was. It sits now near the entrance of the old penitentiary, preserved, visible to anyone who walks through on a tour. A plain wooden chair with leather straps and iron fittings that once carried enough current through a human body to stop a heart. Chapter 6: Notorious Names Behind the Walls. A prison this large, holding this many men across more than a century, was bound to collect names that would echo far beyond its walls. Some of the men who passed through Moundsville Penitentiary became infamous for what they had done before they arrived. Others became strange footnotes simply for wanting to get in. Together, their stories reveal a place that was never just a regional facility for regional crimes, but a stage where some of the darkest and strangest chapters of American criminal history briefly intersected. Perhaps no name carries more weight in Moundsville Penitentiary's history than Harry Powers. Convicted in the 1930s of a string of so-called lonely hearts murders, Powers had lured women through correspondence and false promises of marriage, only to unalive them for their money. His crimes were the kind that gripped an entire region in horror, and after his conviction, he was held at penitentiary until his execution in 1932. His story did not end with his death. A native of the town of Moundsville itself, a writer named Davis Grubb grew up in the shadow of the case and, decades later, drew on it to write his novel, The Night of the Hunter, a book that would go on to become one of the most haunting works of American Gothic fiction, later adapted into a classic film. In this way, Moundsville did not simply hold Harry Powers. It quietly shaped a piece of American literature, a dark inheritance passed from a real execution into the imagination of a nation. Long before Powers ever arrived, the prison held a very different kind of prisoner, one whose crime was not violence but conviction. Eugene Debs, the labor organizer and 5-time candidate for President of the United States, was held briefly at Moundsville Penitentiary in 1919, sentenced under the Espionage Act for speaking out against American involvement in the First World War. His stay was short, only a matter of months before he was transferred to a federal facility in Atlanta, but it stands as one of the strangest juxtapositions in the prison's history. Decades later, the prison's reputation had grown strange enough to attract attention from an entirely different kind of infamous figure. In 1983, Charles Manson wrote a letter to the warden at Moundsville requesting a transfer to the facility. He promised, in his own words, not to cause trouble if he were allowed to serve his time there instead. The request was never granted and Manson never set foot inside the penitentiary. But the letter itself survived, a strange artifact of a man, notorious across the entire country, reaching out toward a prison in West Virginia, drawn by its reputation alone. That letter remains on display at the site today, preserved behind glass for visitors to read. a small, eerie reminder of just how far Moundsville Penitentiary's name had traveled. Not every story that came out of these walls was violent or infamous in the traditional sense. Some of the men held at Moundsville left behind a different kind of legacy, painted directly onto the prison's walls. Inmates decorated portions of the cafeteria and other communal spaces with murals, elaborate hand-painted scenes that transformed blank stone into something closer to expression. A kind of testimony from men who otherwise left almost no public trace of themselves. Those murals still exist today, faded but visible, offering visitors a strange contrast to the violence documented everywhere else in the prison's history. Proof that even inside a 5-foot by 7-foot existence, some men found ways to make something that was entirely their own. Escape was the other constant undercurrent running through the prison's history. The most remarkable escape attempt came in 1992, when 3 inmates managed to tunnel their way out of the facility through the prison's greenhouse in the yard, digging beneath the ground, undetected until they broke through to open air outside the walls. It was audacious, patient work, carried out under the noses of guards inside a prison whose design made almost everything else visible to almost everyone. The greenhouse tunnel became one of the final notable episodes in the prison's long and complicated relationship with the men who tried to escape the very walls their predecessors had built. Taken together, these names, a serial killer whose crimes inspired a novel, a presidential candidate jailed for his words, a mass murderer who asked to be sent there voluntarily, painters working in stolen hours, and diggers working in the dark, tell a story that goes well beyond simple statistics of overcrowding and execution counts. Moundsville Penitentiary was never merely a building. It was a place where extraordinary and ordinary lives collided, where fame, infamy, art, and desperation all passed through the same gates and the same cramped, echoing cell blocks, before the prison's final and most violent chapter arrived to bring the entire institution to its knees. Chapter 7. A Prison Turns on Itself. By the middle of the 20th century, Moundsville had settled into a rhythm that looked, from the outside, almost stable. Executions had ended. The population had swelled and then plateaued at a staggering size. The prison had become an old, familiar fixture of the town that surrounded it. The kind of building people stopped noticing, even as it kept absorbing more and more men within its walls. But stability was always an illusion. Underneath the surface, something else was taking shape, something the original architects of the 1860s could never have anticipated. Organized power, built not by the state, but by the inmates themselves. Prison gangs had existed in some form at Moundsville Penitentiary for years, but by the 1970s, they had hardened into something more structured and more dangerous. 2 groups in particular would come to define the prison's internal politics for the next 2 decades: the Aryan Brotherhood and a group known as the Avengers, associated with motorcycle gang culture and fiercely loyal to its own members. These were not loose cliques. They were functioning power structures, controlling territory inside the yard, controlling the flow of contraband moving through the halls, and settling disputes with a violence that had nothing to do with the crimes that had put any individual man behind bars in the first place. Turf, loyalty, and the steady undercurrent of drugs and weapons moving through a building that was never designed with modern security in mind. These became the real currency inside the walls. The prison's own architecture made this kind of internal power structure almost inevitable. The open design of the north and south halls, the same design that let sound and sight lines travel the length of an entire cell block, also meant that guards could never fully control what was happening inside. As the years wore on, security at the facility grew looser rather than tighter. Locks on many cells had been picked or worn out entirely, and inmates moved through the halls with a level of freedom that would have been unthinkable in a more modern facility. The prison had become something close to a Khan's prison, a place where the men inside, not the guards outside, set the real rules of daily life. It was against this backdrop, in March of 1973, that Moundsville experienced its first major uprising. Inmates seized control of a portion of the facility, taking 5 hostages and setting fire to the basement of the stockade. It was a smaller, shorter event than what would come 13 years later, and it ended without the loss of life that would define the prison's next major riot. but it revealed exactly how fragile the balance of control inside Moundsville had become. A prison holding thousands of men, run by a staff perpetually outnumbered, inside a building whose very design worked against containment, was not a stable system quietly waiting to be fixed. It was a system waiting for its next spark. That spark would take over a decade to fully ignite, but the conditions that would eventually cause it were already firmly in place by the time the fires from the 1973 uprising had been put out. Overcrowding continued to worsen. Gang loyalties continued to harden into rival factions that despised one another as much as they despised the institution holding them. Maintenance and sanitation problems, the same kind of decaying infrastructure that had plagued the prison for years, continued to fester the floors of the very cafeteria where inmates and guards ate together every single day. Nothing about the 1973 riot fixed any of this. If anything, it simply demonstrated to the men inside exactly how much power they could seize, for however brief a window when the state's control faltered even slightly. For the next 13 years, Moundsville Penitentiary carried this tension quietly, an aging Gothic fortress holding more than 4 times the population it was ever built to contain, run by rival gangs as much as by state-appointed guards, its plumbing rotting beneath its floors, its locks failing one by one. Everyone connected to the prison, staff, and inmates alike, seemed to sense that something larger was coming. They simply did not know when. The answer arrived on the first day of a new year, in a moment the state would never fully recover from, and the prison itself would never truly survive. Chapter 8, New Year's Day, 1986. The first day of 1986 began quietly, the way holidays inside a prison often do. Staffing was thin, many of the regular guards were home with their families, replaced by a skeleton crew working the shift no one wanted, and the corridors of Moundsville Penitentiary, usually tense but manageable, carried the particular stillness of an institution running on a reduced schedule. It was exactly the kind of moment a prison this size, this overcrowded, and this loosely controlled could not afford to be caught off guard. And at around 5:30 in the evening, it was. 20 inmates, members of the gang calling themselves the Avengers, moved on the mess hall together. It happened fast. Within seconds, they had overwhelmed the guards on duty, 5 officers and a kitchen worker, seizing control of the room before anyone could raise an alarm that mattered. The inmates cuffed their hostages using the guards' own handcuffs. Hostages were threatened at knife point, some of the blades improvised, some smuggled in, as the uprising spread outward from the cafeteria. The prison's own design, the same open, sightline-heavy layout that had made it nearly impossible for guards to control internal movement for years, now worked entirely in the inmates' favor. Once the captain's booth was overrun and the keys taken from the guards being held, the South Hall fell without meaningful resistance. Word spread through the halls, and the rebellion grew. 16 guards in total were eventually taken hostage as the uprising expanded across the facility. Offices were ransacked, furniture and records were destroyed. Damage to the South Hall and the administrative areas would later be estimated at $200,000, a number that reflected only the physical destruction, not the human cost still unfolding behind the walls. Outside the prison, the state scrambled to respond. Governor Archmore made the decision to go inside personally, entering the prison to negotiate directly with the men who now controlled large sections of it. Leading the negotiations from the inmates' side was a man named Danny Lemon, president of the Avengers, who had not personally taken part in the initial takeover of the cafeteria, but stepped forward as the gang's chief negotiator and public voice once the uprising was underway. Lehman spoke to the media, laid out the inmates' demands, and worked to keep the standoff from spiraling further out of control. Complaints about the physical conditions inside the prison ran through nearly every grievance raised during the negotiations. Chief among them, the plumbing. A leaking sewer pipe running beneath the cafeteria floor had, for months, filled the dining hall with an unbearable smell every time inmates sat down to eat. A small daily indignity that had quietly built into something much larger. It was, in the words of one longtime prison guide who later described the uprising, difficult to imagine simply trying to eat a meal under conditions like that, day after day, year after year, with no end in sight. The standoff stretched on for 2 full days. Inside that window, away from the negotiations happening in public view, a darker chapter unfolded entirely out of the state's control. 3 inmates, believed by other prisoners to be informants who had passed information to guards and administrators over the years, were killed by their fellow rioters during the uprising. It was not the state exacting punishment. It was the inmates themselves, operating under their own brutal internal code, using the chaos of the takeover to settle scores that had been building for years. None of the official hostages, the guards and the kitchen workers seized at the very start, were seriously harmed throughout the entire ordeal. When the uprising finally ended, the hostages were released largely unharmed, and the immediate crisis was over. Governor Moore's negotiations produced concrete concessions. The state agreed to significant reforms, including plans to finally build a new cafeteria to replace the decaying, foul-smelling one that had helped ignite the unrest in the first place. In the months that followed, the violence did not simply stop. 1986 would go on to become the deadliest year at Moundsville Penitentiary in over a quarter of a century, with 6 prisoners killed in total across the 12 months that followed the initial riot, and twice as many injured in the ongoing unrest that lingered in its aftermath. State officials spent hundreds of thousands of dollars reinforcing the prison's security in the months after the uprising, rebuilding the captain's office into something far harder to overrun, and installing new electronic locking systems on doors that had, for years, been secured by little more than aging mechanical locks and a rapidly thinning staff of guards. But something had shifted permanently after those 2 days in January. The prison's own leadership admitted just how vulnerable the institution truly was, acknowledging openly that, with guards outnumbered as much as 13-1 during a typical shift, the kind of control the state believed it maintained over Moundsville Penitentiary had been an illusion for a very long time. The uprising exposed the prison completely, its aging architecture, its overwhelmed staff, its rotting infrastructure, all of it laid bare in front of the entire state, and, soon enough, the entire country. And even as officials scrambled to patch the physical damage and tighten the locks, a separate reckoning was already quietly working its way through the courts, one that would ask a far larger question than who had taken control of the prison for 2 days in January. It would ask whether a prison built like this one, cramming men into stone boxes 5 feet by 7 feet for the whole of their sentences, had any right to exist at all. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. The riot that erupted on the first day of 1986 felt to most people watching from outside like the event that finally exposed Moundsville Penitentiary for what it had become. But the truth is that the legal reckoning had already been building for years, quietly moving through the courts long before the Avengers ever stormed the cafeteria. Back in 1981, an inmate named Robert Crane had filed a petition challenging the fundamental conditions of his confinement, arguing that the prison itself violated the basic constitutional protections owed to the men held inside it. It was a slow-moving case, the kind that rarely makes headlines while it winds through the system, but it was asking a question far more dangerous to the prison's future than any single riot ever could. It was asking whether the cells themselves, 5 feet by 7 feet, built more than a century earlier by the hands of earlier inmates, were fit for human beings to live inside at all. The case crept forward through the state's court system for years, gathering evidence and testimony about what daily life inside those cells actually looked like. The same conditions that had defined Moundsville Penitentiary since its earliest days. The triple bunking, the absent privacy, the decaying plumbing, none of it new information to anyone who had ever worked or lived inside the walls. What was new was a court willing to weigh all of it together and ask whether it amounted to something the Constitution simply would not permit. In 1986, the same year the prison descended into the chaos of the New Year's Day uprising, the West Virginia Supreme Court delivered its ruling in the case Robert Crane had first filed 5 years earlier. The court found that confining inmates in cells measuring 5 feet by 7 feet constituted cruel and unusual punishment, a violation grave enough that the state could not simply patch its way around it with minor repairs or promises of future reform. It was a stunning conclusion for an institution that had operated for 120 years by that point, a prison raised from the ground up by the hands of its own inmates, now formally condemned by the very legal system it had spent over a century serving. The state did not shut the doors immediately. Officials proposed various plans to bring the aging facility into compliance, renovations, restructuring, ways of stretching the old Gothic fortress just far enough to satisfy the court's demands without abandoning the building outright. The court rejected these proposals one after another. The fundamental problem was not a broken pipe or a missing partition wall. It was the building itself, its very bones, cells carved into solid stone that could not be renovated into something acceptable, no matter how much money the state was willing to spend. The prison's population had already begun a slow decline as newer facilities elsewhere in the state opened their doors, and by the time the court's ruling took full effect, that number had fallen to somewhere around 700 inmates. The final decision came in 1995. After 129 years of continuous operation, the West Virginia Penitentiary at Moundsville closed its doors for good. The remaining inmates were transferred to a newly built facility, Mount Olive Correctional Complex in Fayette County, a modern structure built specifically to meet the standards the old prison never could. A smaller regional jail eventually opened roughly a mile away from the original site, a quiet acknowledgement that the town still needed some form of local detention, even as its most famous and most infamous building fell permanently silent. The court had spoken. The building that generations of inmates had built with their own hands, and that had held men in conditions the state itself once helped design, was finally formally condemned for what it had always been. Chapter 10: Life After Death. When the last inmates were transferred out of Moundsville in 1995, the prison did not disappear. Buildings this large, this heavily built, and this deeply woven into the identity of a town do not simply vanish once their original purpose ends. The walls that had taken a decade to raise, the stone quarried and carried by the very men once caged inside them, remain standing long after the state's authority over the men themselves had ended. Almost immediately, people began to talk about the building differently than they had while it was still an active prison. Rumors of strange happenings inside Moundsville Penitentiary had circulated even before the final closure, whispered among guards and staff who worked long shifts inside a building, already 129 years old by the time it shut its doors. Once the inmates were gone, those rumors did not fade. If anything, they grew louder, feeding off a building now empty of the daily noise and routine that had once filled every hall, leaving behind only stone, shadow, and silence. Visitors and staff began reporting sightings of what came to be known as the Shadow Man, a dark, static-like silhouette said to move through certain corridors of the old penitentiary, along with other unexplained sounds and sensations that seemed to cling to a building where so many men had lived, suffered, and died across more than a century. The Moundsville Economic Development Council took over management of the site, and rather than letting the old fortress crumble into ruin, the town found a new purpose for it, one built almost entirely around its dark reputation. Guided tours began welcoming visitors into the same halls where inmates had once slept 3 to a cell, walking them past the cramped cells, the old execution chamber, and, elsewhere on the grounds, old Sparky itself, preserved and on display for anyone willing to look at it directly. For those seeking something more intense than a daytime walkthrough, the site began offering midnight tours, allowing braver visitors to explore the darkened cell blocks on their own until the early hours of the morning, chasing the same rumors of hauntings that had followed the building since its final years of operation. A seasonal attraction called the Dungeon of Horrors turned portions of the prison into a haunted house each autumn, transforming genuine historical horror into something visitors could walk through for entertainment. A strange but undeniably fitting second life for a building whose entire architecture had once been designed to convey exactly that same sense of dread. The prison's usefulness did not end with tourism alone. In 2009, the West Virginia High Technology Consortium Foundation completed a full 3-dimensional digital model of the entire structure. Technology that allowed law enforcement agencies to study the building's layout in detail and plan responses to hypothetical emergencies. That same layout, the one that had made the 1986 uprising so difficult to contain, made the real building an ideal setting for something else entirely: training. Each spring, the mock prison riot brings law enforcement and corrections teams from across the country to Moundsville Penitentiary, running realistic tactical exercises inside the very halls where a real riot had once claimed 3 lives and taken 16 guards hostage. It is one of the stranger turns in the building's long history. A place once condemned for its cruelty now used to teach the professionals of tomorrow how to prevent exactly the kind of chaos that had unfolded there decades earlier. Hollywood found the building too. Its unmistakable Gothic silhouette and genuinely aged interior made it a natural filming location for stories about confinement and punishment. Appearing in the film Out of the Furnace, released in 2013, and later serving as a stand-in for Shawshank State Prison in Hulu's series Castle Rock. Today, the tour guides who lead visitors through Moundsville Penitentiary are frequently the ones who best understand what the building actually represents. Men like longtime guide Tom Stiles have spent years walking guests past the cramped cells, the isolation wards, and the execution chamber, explaining in plain terms exactly how bad conditions had become by the time the courts finally intervened. What began as a fortress built to punish has become a place people now pay to enter voluntarily, drawn by the same dark reputation the state once tried desperately to hide. Chapter 11. What the Walls Remember. There is a strange closed logic to the story of Moundsville, one that runs from its very first stone to its very last day in operation. A state with nowhere to put its prisoners built a place to hold them, and it built that place using the hands of the men it would soon lock inside. When it needed a machine to end lives, it turned again to a man already condemned and asked him to wire together the very chair that could one day have been used on him instead. The building punished the people who raised it, then armed itself against them. Then when the reckoning finally came, was condemned by the same legal system it had served for over a century. What lingers now, walking through those cold halls, is not simply the memory of violence, though there was plenty of that. What lingers is the sheer weight of ordinary time, decades upon decades of men living inside spaces 5 feet by 7 feet, waking each morning to walls their predecessors had quarried and set in place with their own hands. A prison is usually thought of as something done to people from the outside, imposed by a state, enforced by guards, sealed by locks. Moundsville Penitentiary complicates that picture. It was, in a very real sense, built from the inside out, shaped by the very people it was designed to contain. That contradiction is the truest legacy of the place. Not a haunted house built for entertainment, not simply a filming location or a training ground for tactical teams, but a physical record of what happens when a system asks the condemned to construct their own condemnation over and over until the weight of that logic becomes impossible to sustain. The stone walls still stand along Jefferson Avenue today, 24 feet high, exactly where inmates left them more than a century ago. They no longer hold anyone against their will, but they remember, in the only way a building can remember, every hand that ever touched them. And every reason those hands were forced to build a cage they would one day have to live inside.